want to sit up here too?
No, wait.
You don't have to.
When is at the end?
You can come up front, lady. All right. I'd like to welcome you this evening to the evening's lecture, and on behalf of the Lectures Committee and Student Body Government who funded this, this evening we are, I think, very fortunate to have our guest for at least two reasons. One good reason is that there's a great deal of ferment in China and a great deal of confusion in, I think, the Western press about what is going on in China to a certain extent. And if you've followed the press at all, you've noted that the present leadership has said over the past, say, 6 months, things like the country can expect 100 flowers in science and culture to bloom, and in particular, that a new spring in art and literature can be expected. Now, this has raised all kinds of anticipations on the part of the Western press that all kinds of things are going to happen. And you find projections based upon some of these statements that things will change in the arts and the sciences. Things will, we will find new currents and new cultural achievements, perhaps. And if you look at the reports in the last several months, and even in the last month, for example, you can find reports that things are changing in China. And I'll just give you a couple as illustrations. Peking Radio, it is said, now airs, quote, lilting folk songs and traditional Chinese music, which apparently they didn't do in the past. Recently, a Canadian brass quintet visited China and played music from Bach to Beethoven, music that was heavily criticized as reactionary 2 or 3 years ago. The quintet was praised in the People's Daily on March 26th was praised for its, quote, skill, fidelity, and interpretation and lively, bright performance, which left the audience with a deep impression, end quote. These are the signs of the new spring, apparently, but it's a very difficult thing to deal with, I think, because we've got, for one thing anyway, we have a distorted Western journalist, or Western journalists distorting variety of events and occurrences in China and interpreting things. And if you read their commentaries, they are essentially perceiving this as a great sign of progress, that China is coming around finally to the Western view of things, that there is that the Western approach to the arts, for example, is the way to go, the only way to go. We have a problem here. This could be a pattern of continuity where we're jumping the gun quite a bit. It's difficult to tell what all these events mean. And another problem we have is just how much of a lid really was on the creative arts in China, the performing arts in China, over the past 25 years. And then, of course, the projection question is what kind of changes can we expect in the next decade or so? These are the types of questions that are being raised, at least in the Western press on China. And I think we are very fortunate this evening when we have a lecture titled The Theater in Revolutionary China, or the theater's role in revolutionary China, that will raise perhaps some of these issues, or maybe clarify them for us at least. And the second reason that we're very fortunate here is that we've got somebody who has experienced the whole thing. As Chairman Mao said once, if you want to know the taste of a pear, you have to taste it, or something to that effect. And it wasn't particularly, what's the word? It was a pretty simple statement, but it needs to be it needs to be stressed now and then. We do have people who speak at this podium occasionally who know not a great deal. In our case tonight, I believe we have somebody who knows a great deal. She trained at the Shanghai Dramatic Academy, graduated there in 1952, and from 1952 to 1971, she worked with the Shanghai People's Arts Theater, performing primarily in plays about the history of China in the past 150 years, but also in some Western authored plays. Thus, she has been directly involved in her, in the subject that she's talking about. She brings to us certainly a whole new dimension of China that we haven't really investigated here at all before. I believe we are in for a very stimulating evening, and I'm very pleased to introduce Chen Yuanqi.
Thank you. I think just like the Professor Andrew, I don't know your first name, Adrian, said that since 1972, there are at least 8,000 to 10,000 Americans have visited China in the past 5 years. Plus, of course, maybe a few hundred or over 1,000 American Chinese have gone back for visits in China. So I think a lot of Americans here now know something about China and have visited a few cities, communes, and factories, and usually brought back, at least I think openly, I've always heard very favorable remarks about what's going on in China. Probably privately have some doubts about what they have seen in China. That's very natural because for a few weeks and with a guided tour, what you can see is very limited. And particularly when you try to interpret it, you'll find it very difficult. So for me to speak here tonight, I would want to explain that because of my own upbringing and my education and my work in China, I'm used to certain concepts, particularly when in my talk, I'm used to certain terminologies which may sound very strange to you or even very repulsive to you because you're not used to it. But to me, it comes very natural. I try to modify it so you can you can accept it or you can understand it easier for you to understand. But I think if I worry about this too much, then I won't be able to speak very openly or very straightforward with you. So I think I'll try to explain everything which I have experienced, I observed during my lifetime in China. And if you have any questions, you can raise after my talk. And Jerry and I both would be willing to answer any questions. So first of all, like Adrian said, that China is experiencing at this moment, some changes. It's not quite clear yet, but it's bound to have some changes because just in the past year, China lost 3 major leaders who had founded the People's Republic of China. Zhu De was the first one, and then followed by Zhou Enlai, and then Mao Zedong. Last September, he died. What the Chinese Revolution, Mao Zedong led the Chinese Revolution, and he paved the way for the Chinese people to march along this road. And he set up all kinds of guidelines and policies in every field for the Chinese people to carry it out. So up to this point, what the Chinese followed was Mao's line, basically. Although during certain years in the past, from 49 to 76, there were times when other policies prevailed in China in a very short period, particularly in the early 60s, from 60 to 62. But basically, Mao always could bring back push the Chinese people along the way that he wanted, that he had charted for the Chinese. So what my own experience was based on Mao's guidelines, and because what we went through in the Cultural Revolution was to review our work, reevaluate our work, and criticize ourselves, and really understand what Mao wanted us to do. So from the beginning, I want to first introduce you to a very different concept of art and literature. That is the role of theater in the Chinese Revolution. The revolution I'm referring to is the revolution which led to the founding of the People's Republic of China under the leadership of Chairman Mao. At the very beginning of this revolution, the Chinese Communist Party made it very plain why it is necessary to include art and literature as a component part in the revolution. The theory behind this is, as Chairman Mao stated in his article on New Democracy, which he wrote in 1940, which says, quote, "Revolutionary culture is a powerful revolutionary weapon for the broad masses of the people. It prepares the ground ideologically before the revolution comes, and is an important, indeed essential, fighting front in the general revolutionary front during the revolution." And here I might add, after the revolution, its sole task, the art and literature's sole task is to serve the economic base and to consolidate the new revolutionary power. This is the principle Mao had set for art and literature. So in practice, how does it function? The Chinese Revolution always had two armies, the army with guns and the army with pens, as we say, which means the cultural army. The Communist Party acknowledges the importance of army with guns to win the revolution. Of course, Mao had always said the power comes from a barrel of gun. But at the same time, it always deemed the cultural army as absolutely indispensable for uniting her own ranks and defeating her enemy. So put in practice, from the very early days, in the Red Army days, that was when Mao was fighting the nationalists from the mountains in Jinggang Mountain during those days. And then afterwards, the long march from Zunyi all the way to Yan'an, 7,000 miles long march. And in the years of war of resistance against Japanese aggression, followed by the War of Liberation from 45 to 49. And after the liberation of the whole nation, except Taiwan now, the theater arts carried out the tasks outlined by Chairman Mao, which combines education, propaganda, and entertainment in performing arts. In the tough years of civil war between the nationalists and the communists from 1927 to 1937, hundreds of cultural teams were formed, which consisted of song and dance, skits, living newspapers, Peking operas, and its variation of provincial local operas, folk arts, all kinds of theatrical art forms which were familiar and acceptable to the masses of people. These cultural teams, which were formed by the Communist Party, marched alongside with the Red Army, and they produced programs to inspire and educate the army. Many of their programs were quite successful and lasted until today. It remains to be very popular with the workers, peasants, and soldiers. And these cultural teams not only performed for the army, but in times of actual fighting with the enemy, the men in the cultural teams turned into medical evacuation teams. And the women became first aid nurses. So they helped the fighting. And after the Red Army entered into a new territory, taken in a new territory, it was the task of the cultural teams to calm the fears of the people, of the local people, explain the policies of the Communist Party so as to win the confidence of the people. All of these were done in art forms. You know, it's not just talk, but they would produce immediately skits or song or whatever art form which would be very familiar to this particular local people, and the cultural teams would produce programs just to explain the policies of the Red Army and the policies of the Communist Party, and to calm their fears and make them accept the Red Army. So in the process of consolidating the liberated areas and carrying out various political programs, the cultural teams would produce programs, and they would coordinate with the political movements. This has always been the tradition of theater arts under the leadership of Communist Party all the way until 1949. Since the founding of the People's Republic of China, the conditions for the theater people had changed for the better. Their lives were more stable, and they have better equipment and communications, plus cultural exchange with foreign countries became possible and gradually increasing after 49. Then this exchange with foreign countries, which has both its positive and negative effects on the Chinese people. Although the principle of the theater arts remained the same, there were times the cultural workers, as we call them, because in China, we don't call artists, we don't call them artists. We call them cultural workers, so as to make it clear that they are not a special group of people who are divorced from production workers or peasants in the countryside, to indicate that this is just a division of labor between people. So you work in cultural field, you're called cultural worker. He works in the factory, he's a production worker. So the cultural workers, after 1949, because of the change of conditions, at times, the writers and actors working in the cultural field deviated from the guiding lines set up by Mao. The deviation was caused by the easier living conditions and outside influence. And the confusion, what is the confusion? The confusion is, who should we serve first? Are we going to serve the workers, peasants, and soldiers, or are we going to place more emphasis on serving intellectuals and bourgeoisie in the city? Because in the Red Army days, there was no confusion. Of course you serve workers, peasants, mainly peasants, really, because you went through all the rural areas. Mostly the Red Army, what they took over was rural areas, so you serve the local people, they're all peasants. But once, after the founding of the People's Republic, then you march into those major cities where you have lots of intellectuals, and you have lots of national bourgeoisie in the big cities. So who should we serve first? This became a question. The other question was whether the relationship between popularization and elevation of art and literature. Should we popularize first, or should we raise the standard first? This is one question. Follow this question is, use what kind of form and content to popularize, and toward which direction to raise our standard? You see, who set up the standard? What is supposed to be the highest standard for art and literature? How do we measure it? If we follow the Western standard, or we in China would say the bourgeois standard, which means we should elevate our art and literature towards the direction of Western bourgeois art and literature, which means if we reach that standard, then we're perfect. If we don't reach that standard, then we are low. Is that the way to measure it? This is a very important question. These confusions made the cultural workers at times forget what is needed and can be accepted by the workers, peasants, and soldiers, and became overly enthusiastic in raising the standards of art and literature to the heights of the feudal bourgeois or petty bourgeois intellectual standard, which, as we found out later when we review our work, was a disservice to the workers and peasants, because the result of this kind of elevation was undermining the efforts of the workers and peasants and soldiers in their effort to build a new socialist China. The well-publicized Cultural Revolution started in 1966 was a review of the cultural work from 49 to 66 on a massive scale, inviting the whole nation to investigate and reevaluate the role of culture in a socialist construction. And in its process, the Cultural Revolution touched upon the political and economic fields. Now here I want to pause for a little while and introduce my own work and my own background. In 1949, I applied to study acting in Shanghai Dramatic Academy. Before that, I had interest in theater because of my family. During the war years in Chongqing, my family was in Chongqing. The theater arts were blooming in Chongqing because they produced lots of those plays concerning the war against Japanese, and we had many good actors in Chongqing. So when my parents used to take me to the theater, so I became very interested in theater. But in those days, in China, at least I'm talking about the areas nationalist government was in control. The status of theater people, whoever worked in the cultural field, wasn't very high. Particularly the actresses were looked upon not too differently from prostitutes because of the theater were mostly controlled by the gangsters, and they would force the actresses to do whatever they want them to do. And if you want to be in that field, if you were really after fame and position, then you would compromise yourself intellectually and physically. So that's the reason that the status of theater people, particularly actresses in the society, was very low. So although I was interested in theater, but I never thought I would enter that field before 1949. But when liberation came in Shanghai, there were troops, cultural troops, which were sent from the liberated areas, because there were 1/4 of Chinese territory long before 49 was under the control of the Communist Party. And like I said, they had their own cultural teams, they had their own production, they had their own tradition. So when 49 came, of course, Shanghai became a new territory for the Communist Party. So you follow their tradition. The cultural troops were all sent in to this big city to educate us in Shanghai. So we saw many of those new productions and traditional, liberated area productions, like White-Haired Girl was in opera form at that time, and also the several dramas. One of them called the Enemy Without Gun, which means the hidden enemy, KMT, Kuomintang agent, this kind of plays, drama. And I went to see these plays, and I was quite moved by some of them, and I find the acting style was very, very realistic, and I could tell the actors in those plays were really part of the masses because they behaved and they depicted these peasants or soldiers on the stage so realistically. You know, you're bound to be moved by them and forget that these are the actors, you know, as if really a real slice of life depicted on the stage, and it was very fresh for us. So, on the other hand, also the publications, you know, right after 49 when Communist Party took over Shanghai, the publications emphasized on these kind of cultural activities, and they had you know, evaluated these works very highly. So we could see that the whole concept of art and literature was changing, and the social status of these kind of people was quite different from what we looked upon, you know, theater people before 49 in the nationalist areas. So I became interested and thought, you know, well, now it's different. Nobody looked down upon these kind of people, and actually we looked up to them because they gave us such fresh ideas. So I talked to my family. I said, what about it? Because at that time, the Shanghai Dramatic Academy was started to enroll students. So I said I wanted to go. I convinced my sister and my mother quite easily because they saw things, you know, more or less the same as I did. But my father was a little behind. He wasn't quite convinced that it's changed that much. So he objected. He said, well, can you find something else more worthwhile to do with your life? So I said, well, it's changing. It's not the same as before. Nobody really would look down upon me if I become an actress. But he wasn't convinced. So finally, I went to apply, and I went through the examination anyhow. But after I was accepted, at that time, you see, right after liberation, wasn't completely free. We had to pay a little bit of tuition fee. So my father didn't want to give me that tuition fee. Finally, of course, you know, in China, wives, although nowadays, of course, women are very independent economically, but even then, in 49, I guess my mother could, because the fee wasn't that large, so she could give me out of family expenses, I guess. So she gave me the fee, and I went to the Dramatic Academy. That was the first year, of course. After that, things became very clear. I didn't have any trouble. So that was how I enrolled in the Dramatic Academy. Since then, I became a member of the Chinese Theatrical Circle until I left China at the end of '71. So to be an actress or a cultural worker in China is something very different from any other parts of the world, I think. Of course, that's my thinking. Maybe there are places in this world similar to Chinese situation, but from what I read about other countries, even other socialist countries, I find it still quite different. Because the importance of the Communist Party placed on culture, the responsibility of cultural workers in China has greatly increased. We are not looked upon as just entertainers. Rather, we are more like educators. We're told it is our responsibility to use the form of theater arts to interpret the revolutionary programs and party policies, and to set moral standards in society, and to inspire the people towards building a new independent socialist China. Any cultural worker in China who try to seek self-expression, seek limelight, fame, or position, sooner or later, this person, this actor, or whatever you're doing in the cultural field, would be subjected to severe criticisms. The periodical rectification movements in the cultural circles are just aimed at this kind of people. So in order to perform our responsibilities as cultural workers and geared to the guidelines set up by the Communist Party, the Chinese cultural workers have to obtain the stand and the viewpoint of the workers, peasants, and soldiers, to remold our world outlook, to see the society and the world through the eyes of the workers, peasants, and soldiers. To put these in very concrete terms, this means we have to integrate ourselves with the workers, peasants, and soldiers. We have to go to the countryside, go to the factories and army camps, not as visitors or just as a person go there to collect material for my production or to be an observer in these places, but to live, work, and study with them from time to time. Try to get them to accept us as one of them. This is necessary because it is the only way we would be able to understand their inner thoughts, their feelings, and their inspirations. And our work is precisely to portray the heroes among the workers, peasants, and soldiers. For it. But this is the kind of human quality we want to cultivate, to let it grow and prosper. Our theory for creative work is to combine revolutionary realism with revolutionary romanticism, which means we are not acting only as a mirror of the society, but we also have an ideal which we wish to fulfill. When we depict a person on the stage, we depict a piece of life of society on the stage. We are not trying to depict them as it stands now, but as a society or a human being should be in the future. This is when the romanticizing comes in. In practice, the heroes on the stage would become the models in daily life for people. The impact of art and literature on shaping the social, moral, and the behavior of human beings in society is so great. So from our own experience, the cultural workers in China feel they have a very great responsibility, and also they feel it's a challenge if you can really help shape the society and shape the behavior of human beings. Now we have, throughout our work in China, from my own experience, we have positive examples of our work, but we also have negative examples of our work. And this is very good because we learn from these negative examples, so we know what to prevent. You see, we put on all kinds of plays in the 50s and in early 60s. Used to be we have a annual schedule of, say, we want to put on 12 plays for this year. Then we have 1/3 of our plays selected from Western classics. Western classics and Western modern contemporary plays. We select 4 of them, and then we select 1/3 from the Chinese classics. And then we have 1/3 from Chinese contemporary, which our playwrights in the theater would create, or if some other theater has a new play, we can always take it from them. So it's 1/3. This is the proportion we maintained for many, many years. That's why we produced all kinds of play in the 50s and 60s. And because we always collect reactions from the audience, we called seminars, we select representatives from different groups to talk to us, and also they would send in letters about their comments, their criticisms or their praises to us. So we can evaluate the work, our own work. And there were also direct reactions when we put on a play on the stage. For example, we put on now I'll give you the positive examples, which we put on. One play was called Zhao Xiaolan, which was a play wrote for during the period of 1952, when the marriage law was proclaimed in China. This was because this was the first law after liberation, and try to protect the rights of women and children. And this was a play about a peasant girl who once understood the marriage law, who had enough courage to stand up for her own rights. Who, in the play, she was among the first ones in the countryside to have a free choice of her own lover. But of course, in the process, she had to fight with her father, fight with matchmakers, this kind of this story. And after we produced this play, we took it to the factories and countryside too. And we find the reactions, because that was closely connected with the movement during that period. Everybody was studying that marriage law, and everybody was discussing about it, and was a upheaval in the society, because it was such a, it's a breaking point in China, particularly in the countryside. The feudal system was so deep-rooted, whereas a young girl looking for her own lover and have a free choice, that was unheard of before, and was looked upon as a scandal if a young girl was going around with her own choice and fighting for her own rights. So when we put on this play, of course, the heroine in the play was such a young girl. So when we presented this play, we get reactions directly from the audience, because the audience immediately, relate to this some relate to this young girl, sympathize with her. Some was, those older generation, those particularly probably fathers or mothers, was really resentful that we put on this young girl as the heroine on the stage, and this was, what kind of impact. So you get, particularly the Chinese peasants and workers, I love that kind of audience, because they're so straight and they're so enthusiastic. Also, they are so, how do you say, if they feel something, they'll express it right in the audience. This way you get the direct reaction, and you really, you say they're not so sophisticated, not like we have intellectual audience. You never get anything from them, because because they feel if I express myself, maybe that shows I'm not sophisticated enough, so I have to hold in. If I want to laugh, I laugh halfway. If I want to cry, I cry halfway. Never show my emotion. But this has no problem with workers and peasants. They agree with you. When the young girl was fighting with her father, and you have people from the audience shouting slogans, supporting, right on, go ahead, this kind of, and then you have the other side with a boo, this, because they disagree with this kind of behavior on the stage. So this in turn inspired the actors. I think, any actor would appreciate this, because even if you're not so, emotionally involved in this role, just because of this kind of reaction from the audience, they really push you right into that. So I find this kind of reaction, this kind of direct exchange with the audience was very, very exciting and very a very good experience. And we know immediately that our work has some kind of impact on people's thinking. So it's true, we get the result, because after the show, when we go to a local area in the countryside, we usually stay there for a few days. And during the day, we would visit those peasants. If they're working in the field, we try to help them in the field so we can talk to them. And then in the early afternoon, we start to prepare for our show. And so we have some dialogue with the audience during the day, so we can ask them what you feel the next day. How do you feel about the play? What do you talk about? So you get immediately the remarks about certain people feel very encouraged because they see this is a policy, and because the heroine won in the play, and in the process, of course, you explained, what is the government policy now, what we are encouraging. So, and some people, if they have some problems there in their mind, they can't accept this kind of new policy, they also can express it, and we can explain more during the daytime when we are talking with them. So this kind of exchange and this kind of experience, I find it's, from my description, I think you can find, not only we use our profession to depict something and trying to explain something, but we follow up with our dialogues with the audience. So it's quite an educational process, both for them and for ourselves. So in the process, we understand more, what's their inner thought, how they react to this kind of policy, how they react to this kind of relationship. So this is one example. I think it's quite positive in my career. Of course, there are other contemporary plays when we depict some kind of positive character from the workers and peasants. And if we depict it correctly, you often get this kind of positive reaction. But we also have negative examples, the kind of play we put on. Like I said, we used to put 1/3, 1/3, 1/3. So we did put on some Chinese classics. One of them is written by Cao Yu. He's a very famous Chinese writer. He's very respected until today. He's very respected, but he's also a very, very honest writer. After 49, he only wrote 2 plays. One in the early 50s, he wrote about the medical doctors, whom considered these higher intellectuals, and who these kind of people he was very familiar with, because he himself came from a landlord background, and he was educated here before liberation. So he never really understood workers, peasants, and soldiers in China. And he's very honest about it. He tried, but he just felt he couldn't write them in depth. So he just never produced a play about workers, peasants, and soldiers. The next play he produced in the was late 50s. He wrote another play, was a historical play, 胆剑篇. It was about the feudal war between Wu and Yue dynasty. That was another historical play. That was all he produced after 49. But he's respected because he's very honest with his trade, and he never tried to fool anybody. So, and he has experience, he has writing technique, but just because he can't understand workers, peasants, soldiers, so he can't write about them. That is all. But we produced one of his plays he produced in the 30s, the 雷雨, Sunrise, 日出, Sunrise. The story was about, you would call her a high-class prostitute in the 1930s. And it could be interpreted as a tragedy of, or a victim of that society. She was a high-class prostitute. She was surrounded by, people like banker, stockbroker, and homosexual, and all kinds of people that she had to deal with. But she has conflicts in her own mind because she was tempted to that kind of life, and then she found it was empty, and she wanted to get out, but she couldn't get out, and finally she committed suicide. She was caught up in that situation. She couldn't get out of it, and she was agonizing over her own a guilty conscience, and she couldn't get along with the people, this kind of people any longer. Finally, she committed suicide. That was a story about this woman. And you see, when we apportioned ourselves to put 1/3, 1/3, 1/3, you see, after 49, even from our professional viewpoint, every play we want to put on, we have to give some kind of social meaning. You can't just say, I want to produce this just because this play is wonderful, just because the characters are so vivid and we want to produce it. No, this is not good enough. You have to find out, to present to the committee or to the leadership that what kind of social meaning this play would have if we produce it. So for this play, we found the social meaning, which was for the younger generation in China who had never lived that kind of life and who never saw that kind of life before. Maybe it would be helpful if we present this kind of play and to depict that period of Chinese history and that particular sect of life, show them how decadent that was, and show them, this woman became the victim of that kind of society. So that was the rationale of our play. But when we presented it in 1959, we got reactions from the audience. First of all, the audience was a little different from other contemporary plays, which means we attracted more national bourgeoisie in the city who were familiar with that kind of life before, maybe who had lived that kind of life before 49. And also we attracted more intellectuals from government agencies and from universities, these people who read more or who have some kind of background of pre-liberation life, or usually that kind of people we have in our audience. And of course, we also, a small portion of the audience, because we have surveys, you see, every time when we sold the ticket, we'll try to figure out who came to see us, how many, what's the proportion of production workers, what's the proportion of administrative workers, and other kind of audience. So for this play, usually we attracted that kind of audience. And a small portion of school students and workers. But the reaction from the audience was not so positive to us when we review it, because first of all, the most outrageous one, of course, was we got telephone calls from audience who asked our costume designer that where can she buy the same kind of high heel shoes whom the heroine wore in the play. You see, because we reproduced that piece of life, right? And the research was good. So all the, the costume, everything was according to that period of history. And evidently attracted somebody in the audience, and she looked around, she couldn't find that kind of shoes in a shoe store, so she wanted to find out where we got it, so she can go and try and buy a pair or something. And the hairstyle, you see, because the heroine was that kind of hairstyle, and some audience was interested in the hairstyle and asked the makeup, which hairdresser that we had hired. So this kind of reaction that gave us a feeling that this certainly was not the purpose of our play. And we didn't anticipate that we would arouse this kind of interest among people. You see, the social meaning we had put in that play didn't realize, right? We, not many people wrote to us and telling us, oh, now I understand how decadent that society was. And, no, we didn't get that kind of mail, and we didn't get that kind of reaction. So, which means we failed. If that was our purpose, we failed. This was one example that we find, our motivation, or at least our outward purpose, didn't come true. And another example was similar, because we produced Western classic, and we produced Camille, a French play. The storyline was about the same, and we also justified it with the same reason, say, show the French decadent society and that kind of thing, the hypocrisy of that society, what drove Camille to suicide, right? So this play we produced, and sure enough, we didn't, our purpose didn't come true. Instead, now we also got some outrageous reactions, you see, because that was more serious, because we got a letter, actual letter from high school students in Changsha City, who said, I was so moved by the play. Evidently, the heroine acted very well. She was so moved, she cried so bitterly for her, and but in the end, she said, in the letter, she said, I wish I could live even 1 week the life of Camille. Then I would die with my eyes closed. That means, So this was much more serious, than asking about shoes and hairstyles, because this was deeper. Why this young girl who was brought up in a socialist society would want to live the life of Camille. So our presentation was wrong, or because the kind of social meaning we want to extract from the play really isn't there. We just trying to put something on this play, but actually, the writer of that play didn't have the same kind of purpose as we have. So the end result is that, we affected some young people's thinking, and made a misrepresentation of that society. We evidently misled her. So this was another example. And I think, aside from our stage shows, in our daily life, we also could tell that the impact of art and literature is so great. You see, I can tell you a story about my own colleagues. You see, in China, adultery is a punishable behavior. Because we want to protect the family life, because we think family life is very important. Family unit is the basic unit in society. It should be protected. So adultery is frowned upon and can be punished. So one of my colleagues, she committed this because she has 3 children, but she had an affair with another guy, and they were discovered, and she was being criticized in our group. And the first time, usually, the first offender is not too serious, because we find that maybe, she had some kind of, I don't know how to explain it, maybe just go astray once, right? So we try to talk to her, in a group, saying this is wrong, this is you shouldn't do that because you would disrupt other people's life and all that. And then after some time, she committed again. She had an affair with another guy, and it was discovered again. So that time, the second time was more serious, which means you have an enlarged group of people talking to her and saying, because in China, I don't know, the Chinese tradition is that, you always, maybe the phrase is, every Chinese is 爱面子, you don't like to be openly criticized or faith saving. This is very important with the Chinese tradition. So, when you have an enlarged group of people talk to you, of course, naturally more people would know, your mistake. So this is more serious. And but after the second time, it didn't work. She committed third time. Again, she committed adultery. So then, of course, the leadership felt this was quite serious because her husband, this was maybe it's hard for you to understand. When the organization discovered that she committed adultery, nobody told her husband about her affair with the other guy. The reasoning was that you don't want to disrupt the family life. Try to reason with her, make her correct her own behavior. But in the meantime, you don't want to hurt the others, particularly she has 3 children. So, sometimes you feel it's kind of ridiculous because a lot of people know, but the only one who doesn't know is her husband, that she's having an affair with somebody else. But at the third time, the organization was getting impatient, and the people also around her felt, she's very unfair to her husband this way. So, people began to talk, if you continue this way, maybe your husband would discover, and this would really disrupt your own family life. What about your children and all that? So, of course, by this time, she also began to have a little cool-headed, try to think that this is more serious. And usually in this kind of meetings, we would try to talk to the person, to reason with the person, also try to find out the cause of this kind of behavior. Why she does it again, and try to help her to review her own life. Why you feel you have to fall in love with another guy? What's bothering you? What's behind all this? So finally, we analyzed with her, and she talked about her childhood. She talked about her present life. She talked about what she reads, what she thinks. Oh, finally, with a whole group, we figured out, and she agreed that she was deeply influenced by the classic French literature. You see, she was a fan of Balzac. From very, very early age, she read all the translation. The Chinese translation work was very good. We translated the whole works of Balzac and Dostoevsky and all the great writers of the 18th and 19th centuries of French and Russian and English. So she was a fan of Balzac, and she read all the translated works of Balzac, and she really felt, she used to imagine and put herself in that kind of, position of certain heroines in Balzac novel. And she told us that one of the novels of Balzac novels, where the heroine, said, a husband is not enough. You must have a lover at the same time. And evidently, she imagined about it. She had this kind of illusions or whatever, and she put it into practice. So she again and again fell in love with someone else. Not that she hated her husband. No, she said she doesn't hate her husband. She doesn't, but she just felt this is more romantic if I have a husband and I have a lover at the same time. So this was the the kind of impact you'll find because when she first committed this kind of mistake, both she and we didn't understand what caused it until finally we tried to talk it out, try to analyze, and she really went very deep into her own thinking. Then she found out she was influenced by that kind of novel. So these facts really proved that art and literature do exert a great influence on mental and social consciousness. So if we handle it carelessly, it could give people wrong ideas and could be poisonous to people's minds. So because of this kind of experience, we realize, like in Chinese society, the workers and peasants, they need the service of intellectuals. They need to unite with the intellectuals, providing these intellectuals share the same goal as they have. So to put this idea in a common sense, which means in the Chinese society, the workers and peasants, they are the people who are responsible for producing material wealth for Chinese societies to develop. But the cultural workers, the people in superstructure, they're responsible for creating spiritual wealth for the Chinese society to develop. This is a division of labor between production workers, peasants, and superstructure, the people in superstructure, work in superstructure. So when you think in such terms, then the next question is, you see, the workers and peasants, they're responsible to feed us, to clothe us, to build buildings for us to live in. And the things they produce has to be good and gradually make it more and more perfect and also healthy for us, right? They produce food for us. It can't be poisonous because otherwise we'll be dead. And if anybody try to put poison in the food we eat, then he'll be caught as a counter-revolutionary, enemy of the people. So there's no problem with workers and peasants. Whatever they produce is good for the society. Accumulate the material wealth for the society, and it got to be healthy, good. But for the other part, for us, cultural workers, what we produce, whether this is really good for the development of the society, whether it is healthy for the society, this is abstract. How to measure this? Because it's possible for us to produce something harmful for the society spiritually, but we may not be caught right away. Not like a worker put poison in the food, then he'll be discovered very quickly. But if we put some wrong ideas, some poisonous ideas into people's minds, we may not be caught right away. It's very, very tricky, the kind of things that we produce, how to measure this, whether it's good or bad for the society. So this is our responsibility. So any ideological influence which is detrimental to this effort is impermissible in Chinese society. Maybe you can put in a little bit because it's abstract, you're not caught right away, but sooner or later when they evaluate the work, and measure the reactions, measure the social effect of your work, they'll discover that what is good, what is bad, because the goal is there, what we want. So because of the majority of the Chinese people want to protect the moral of this new society, so this is our responsible. This is the way they measure your work. So some people ask, is this brainwashing? I think if you want to put it in this way, I agree with this. It is brainwashing. But I want to point out one fact, that is, I think everybody's thinking is determined by his social being, by his environment, by the people around him. Everybody picks up ideas from books, movies, plays, paintings, all the things around you. And this is more and more so recognized by people here, I think. I was very interested in reading several articles in the New York Times and Time Magazine not too long ago, where I think it was one was the writer who made a survey about the impact of TV programs among the public, and also sometimes I read the readers' letters to the publication, what they found, the impact of certain TV programs on human beings' behavior.